The hearing will please come to order. Before proceeding with the business of the day, without objection, exhibits EA46 and AH1 through AH27 will be made part of the record. Without objection, the transcript of the deposition of Richard Melton of May 27, 1987 will also be made part of the record and be designated as Exhibit EA51. Also, without objection, the transcript of the deposition of Harold G. Cohen will be made part of the record and designated as Exhibit HC1. And may I call upon our counsel to describe this transcript.
Chairman, on June 1, 1987, the committees took the deposition of Harold G. Cohen, an attorney in Malton, New Jersey. Mr. Cohen represents Four Ways Industries, a company in which Mr. Zucker is a substantial investor and a company which has connections with Mr. Hakim. Mr. Cohen testified that in the week and days preceding September 27, 1987, he had meetings with Mr. Zucker and Mr. Hakim. Mr. Hakim then left, and he scheduled a meeting on September 27, 1987, with Mr. Zucker. Mr. Cohen testified that Mr. Zucker told him that he would have to take time out of the meeting on that day to meet with a woman who was coming from the Washington area. He further testified that Mr. Zucker did excuse himself for a brief meeting with this woman, that he believed that the meeting took place at the Philadelphia office, and that Mr. Zucker told him that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss a possible investment with the woman. He testified that Mr. Zucker did not disclose to him at any time the name of the woman, and he does not know who it was.
Thank you very much.
If I said September 27, 1987, I misspoke, obviously. September 27, 1986.
The correction will be noted. Our next witness is Mr. David M. Lewis of Washington, D.C. Mr. Lewis, will you please rise? Raise your hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. Mr. Niels.
Chairman, I believe Mr. Lewis has a very brief statement that he wishes to read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is David M. Lewis. At my side is my law partner, Thomas J. Lockren, who is here today as my counsel. I'm an attorney practicing in Washington, D.C. In October 1986, I was a party to a conversation which at the time I did not consider very important, but based upon later events, appeared to me to be important to the subject matter of the committee's inquiry. Thereafter, in January 1987, I mentioned my conversation to Spencer Oliver, Chief Counsel to the Foreign Affairs Committee. He passed on the information that I had to the committee staff, and I subsequently met with the committee. Thank you.
Mr. Lewis, before we get to the information, perhaps you could just give us a little bit of personal background. Where were you born and raised?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And educated?
I went to college at the Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science and law school at Temple University Law School.
And after you got out of law school, what did you do?
I went to work as a trial attorney at the Securities and Exchange Commission here in Washington, D.C. And I was there until the end of 1974, at which time I left and went into, I was an associate in a the Washington office of a New York law firm, and in 1977 I was a founding partner of the law firm that I'm a member of now.
You might as well state the name of the firm.
Finkelstein, Thompson, Levinson, and Lewis.
And what type of law do you practice?
Primarily securities law.
Do you know a man named Willard Zucker?
Yes, I do.
And when did you first meet him?
I met Mr. Zucker, I believe, in 1972 or 3, I would guess, while I was working at the SEC. He was being interviewed or was a witness in an investigation, and a fellow I carpooled with at the time was giving Mr. Zucker a lift to the airport, I believe, and I met him briefly then.
Have you been in touch with him from time to time since?
Yes. In 1978, we were essentially co-counsel on a case that he had brought to our firm involving an SEC investigation of a client of his. And thereafter, I would be in touch with him maybe once a year at most, just in a casual telephone call or discussion.
Did there come a time when Mr. Zucker contacted you by telephone and asked you a legal question on the subject of real estate?
Yes, yes. I would guess sometime. I don't have an accurate date on this, but I think sometime, I would expect early in 1986. I'm sorry, 1986. Mr. Zucker called and asked a question about whether someone could receive a real estate commission if they were not licensed as a real estate agent. And I remember I asked him where the property was, and he indicated that the property was in Maryland. I told him I might look into it. It was not a question I knew the answer of. I'm not a real estate attorney. And I don't recall whether I ever got back to him or not, but I do recall the conversation.
Just on the question of timing, I take it your recollection is not exact on the issue of when that telephone call took place.
Not at all.
But I take it it's fair to say that it was sometime prior to October 1986.
That's correct.
Did you have a second telephone conversation with Mr. Zucker on the subject of real estate?
Yes, and I would say sometime probably in late September of 1986, we had a discussion in which he asked me that whether I knew of a real estate broker who would take someone on as an agent for a transaction that, or the impression I got from the call was there was a transaction that was to be done, and Mr. Zucker wanted this person to receive a real estate commission from the transaction, and did I know a broker who would hire that person as an agent for that purpose. I said that I'm sure that it would not be too difficult to find someone willing to do that. I didn't, frankly, know of anybody off the top of my head who I could immediately go to and have that done.
For that purpose, I take it meant for just a single transaction?
Yes, yes.
Did there come a time in October of 1986 when you actually met with Mr. Zucker?
Yes, I traveled to Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland on the 9th of October for business, and I met with Mr. Zucker on the morning of the 10th of October.
And I take it you conducted some unrelated business on the morning of the 10th?
That's correct.
And how is it that you know that the date was the 10th of October?
When I was interviewed by the committee staff, I went and checked my records and determined that that was the date.
That's travel records, I take it?
Yes.
Did there come a time when you had concluded your other business and you went to lunch?
That's correct.
And did you have lunch with Mr. Zucker?
Yes, I did.
And were there others present?
Yes, there were.
And did there come a time when the others left for at least a brief period of time?
That's correct.
And did you have a conversation with Mr. Zucker while the others were absent?
Yes, I did.
And would you describe the conversation?
We got into a discussion of the real estate transaction. I guess I was asking some questions about the nature of the property or what was involved, and Mr. Zucker then indicated to me that there wasn't a specific property involved.
Did you say was not a
specific property involved? That I guess I got the impression, I don't recall his exact words, that he had a wealthy client who wanted to in a sense, get money to or reward someone here in the U.S. and was looking for a business transaction to do it in. And we discussed ways that might be done. And but then as we went on, he began to indicate to me that, in fact, it was not necessary that there even be a real business transaction. He essentially was looking for a cover for someone to merely pay money to a certain person here in the U.S. I then asked him who the person was, and he said the person was the wife of someone in the White House. But that they were not paying the money. The money was earned by the person in the White House in some unrelated matter, but they did not want to pay the money to the person in the White House because of his sensitive position. I then asked him who the person in the White House was, and to the best of my recollection, he said it was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
Did he say anything more about how this transaction might be structured?
Yes, he explained it to me in what I call, I don't think he used this word, a mirror transaction. What he was suggesting is that someone here in the U.S. would pay money to Colonel North's wife, or the woman, whatever, and...
Was that someone, the real estate?
The real estate broker, or whoever was going to do this, would pay money to the designated person here, and at the same time, a similar sum of money would be deposited in the payor's bank account in Switzerland or anywhere else in the world the payor wanted.
When you say the payor, you're referring again to the real estate
That's correct.
broker. So that the real estate broker would have a Swiss bank account, and Mr. Zucker's client would put money into that bank account. Simultaneously, the broker in the U.S. would pay money to this person in the U.S.
That's correct.
Did Mr. Zucker mention an amount of money?
Well, I believe he did. I don't have a specific recollection of that amount.
Do you recall telling Spencer Oliver that it was $70,000?
I don't specifically recall that, but that amount in that range, I think, does ring a bell, but I can't tell you now that I recall a specific amount.
But I take it whatever you told Spencer Oliver would have been the best of your recollection at that time.
That's correct.
And can you say that $70,000 is approximately the amount of money?
I think I can.
Did anything come of this conversation?
No, not that I know of.
Did you take any steps to pursue it?
None.
Mr. Lewis, do I take it correctly that you do not know Oliver North
That's correct.
or Mrs. North?
No.
And is it also correct you don't know General Secord?
That's correct.
Or Albert Hakim?
That's correct.
Now, have you been following the story of the Iran-Contra issue?
Generally.
And would it be fair to say that you have no connection with any of the people whose names have been mentioned in connection with that investigation or any of the facts?
That's correct.
And that would, and I take it that would be true of your firm, too?
That's correct.
You don't represent Nicaragua or
No,
Iran
no.
or Cuba or anything like that?
Nothing like that.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Mr. Lyman? Mr. Bannon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lewis, good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to start with a couple of brief questions about your conversation with Mr. Zucker on October 10th. During your October 10th conversation, after Mr. Zucker explained to you that the idea of making what you described as a mirror transaction, did he represent to you in words or substance that the transaction he was considering was perfectly legal?
Well, yes, what he said, and I'm not sure exactly when in the conversation he said it, but he indicated that the person in the White House had earned this money in some unrelated fashion. And so this wasn't, I guess he was trying to tell me it wasn't some sort of payoff or bribe or whatever.
So he essentially did represent to you that it was a legal transaction?
Yes, he did.
And leaving aside the matter of the identification of the individual involved, the substantive conversation ended about there, is that correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. Leaving aside the question of the identity of the individual who was involved, the substantive conversation with Mr. Zucker ended at about that point.
Well, yes.
On this issue.
The whole conversation was 3 or 4 minutes. So.
I understand. Did Mr. Zucker ever ask you in this conversation to do anything specific to assist him?
No.
Mr. Zucker ever state or imply he would compensate you for any assistance you might render?
No.
Did Mr. Zucker ever tell you or ask you to, quote, keep this quiet?
No.
As I understand it, you did not report this conversation to any United States government official for more than 3 months after it occurred. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Please tell the committee why not.
Well, at the time he told me the conversation occurred, I had no idea who Colonel Oliver North was or anything at all, so the whole thing didn't mean very much to me or didn't mean anything, and it was frankly just a brief conversation that I put out of my mind and didn't think about until the events unfolded in the newspaper. And at that point I began dealing with the issue of whether I should come forward with my information. And initially I was concerned that, well, first I hoped that maybe the people involved would come forward themselves and there would never be a need for me to go and speak with anybody about it. But after that appeared not to be the case, I wrestled with it mentally as to what to do and then finally made a decision, and by that time I guess it was toward the end of January.
Does that complete your answer on that?
Yes.
Is it possible that the intervening publicity and the delay in reporting in any way influenced your perception or understanding or recall of this conversation?
I guess it's possible. I mean, I remember, as I said, that the name, I have a fairly certain recall about certain things in the conversation and less good about others. The reference to the White House and to someone's wife is a certainty. The reference to the name is less certain, because again it was a name that meant nothing to me at the time. The reference to the fact that the person was a military person is somewhat certain. But I frankly can't say, although it's possible, that the things I read in the paper influenced my memory.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Lyman, do you have any questions?
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Lewis, I suspect you were also somewhat hesitant to come forward with what might be innuendo that affected somebody else, but you felt it was necessary because you had some information.
That's correct. And when I went to the committee, I indicated that while I asked for no promise that I wouldn't be called as a witness, I indicated if need be I would be, and the committee was forthright in saying that they would thought that unless my testimony was corroborating other testimony, that they probably would not call me.
Yeah. Mr. Lewis, in somewhat the same vein, I feel compelled to ask you a question because we have received information anonymously, a phone call to a staff person who has indicated that you or a member of your law firm has represented the government of Nicaragua or leaders in the Nicaraguan government.
Absolutely no.
And that you have, or members of your law firm have represented the government of Cuba.
Absolutely not. That's just a scandalous lie.
All right. There may be some other Mr. Lewis. I don't know what the source of that information may be. What's your relationship with Spencer Oliver? I've met Mr. Well, I met him in a social occasion, and that was it. How long ago?
In January.
But you had not known him before January of this year?
That's correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions?
Mr. Chairman. I have no questions, Mr. Lewis, but I do want to say that I think the members of the committee understand that this is not an easy appearance for you, and that you come before us at some risk, perhaps, to your own professional standing. You come as a volunteer, and we appreciate that very much. You come to help the committee, and you have done it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I just wanted to say amen to the chairman's remarks. We need citizens who will step up, and Mr. Lewis certainly has done that, and I just wanted to add my commendation.
Senator Heflin?
Mr. Lewis, following the time that you began to see things in the newspapers, did you contact Mr. Zucker relative to these matters?
No.
You, since reading it in the newspaper, you at no time have ever talked to Mr. Zucker about this?
That's correct.
Now, did you, in effect, make an offer to counsel involved in these committees that you might talk to Zucker and attempt to get his cooperation in this matter?
Yes, I had a brief discussion about that with Mr. Oliver.
Hey, but was anything followed up relative to
absolutely
your
not.
offer to talk to Zucker?
Nothing.
But you've had no conversation, no contact with Zucker. How about any representative of Zucker, any of his lawyers, or anything else since that time?
Not that I know of.
You've had none whatsoever with any representative of Mr. Zucker?
That's correct.
That's all.
Mr. Lewis, I wish to associate myself with the remarks of Chairman Hamilton and to thank you for being a good citizen.
Thank you, Senator.
There are no further questions. Mr. Lewis, thank you, and you're dismissed, sir.
Thank you.
I would like to announce at this time that the members of the Senate panel will be meeting immediately upon declaration of recess in the anteroom, and I believe Chairman Hamilton has a
Mr. Chairman, I have a similar announcement for the members of the House Select Committee. We will be meeting in room 301 of this building. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Both meetings are very important, and it's on a subject that we discussed yesterday at lunch, so I hope that all of you will be present. This hearing will stand in recess until 1:30 this afternoon. The hearing will please come to order. Chair recognizes Mr. Niels.
Mr. Chairman, before we begin, I would like to extend to the committee my thanks for the courtesy that they extended to me and my son this morning. Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure, sir.
There's some new exhibits added.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hakim, I think when we broke off yesterday, you were beginning to testify about your efforts to establish a second channel.
Yes, sir.
And by a second channel, I think you indicated you meant an Iranian official different from the one that Mr. Ghorbanifar had produced, through whom you hope to normalize relations, transact business with respect to arms, and hopefully release hostages. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Whose idea was it to look for a second channel?
I believe effectively General Secords, but the unhappiness about the first channel was shared by all people involved. So he came up, I think, with the idea for the first time.
And who actually set out to look for a second channel?
I organized that.
And did you not only organize it, did you also do it?
Yes, sir.
Was anyone in the U.S. government aware of the fact that you were doing it?
Again, through the same chain of command, if you will, General Secord knew. And I do recall also direct conversations that I had from my home in California with Lieutenant Colonel North from his office and to his office from my home, that he wanted to get first-hand report on my progress. I believe General Secord was not available, so there were times that I reported directly about the status of the situation to Colonel North.
So Colonel North was aware of the fact that you were looking for a second channel, but I take it that you were taking the initiative in deciding exactly how to go about doing that.
You are correct, sir.
And I take it that there came a time when you were successful in identifying an Iranian official through whom you thought you might be able to open a second channel.
Eventually, yes, that's correct.
And that was sometime towards the end of the summer of 1986?
That is correct, sir.
And was there a meeting in Brussels with the Iranian official?
There was a meeting arranged that General Secord and I attended to actually evaluate the second channel, evaluation meeting, if you will.
And you met with the official?
That is correct.
And that was in Brussels in August of 1986?
That is correct.
And was any official of the U.S. government present?
No, sir.
And did you, in fact, meet with this official?
Yes, I did.
And did you evaluate him?
I did.
And what was your evaluation? How did he compare to the official that we've been calling the first channel?
I was extremely impressed. I found a new generation in there that I had not come across before. This gentleman is a younger person, and he impressed me very well.
And I take it that he was, you were put in contact with him through other people that you knew and had explored this issue with prior to August.
That's correct.
At this meeting in Brussels, did you talk about future normalization of relations between the United States and Iran?
That was also part of our discussion.
And did you talk about the possibility of providing, of the U.S. government providing arms to Iran?
Yes, we did.
And did you talk about the possibility of Iran arranging the release of prisoners hostages in Lebanon?
Yes, we did.
Prior to the meeting in Brussels, had you had discussions with General Secord or Colonel North on the subject of your financial interest in this continuing project?
Prior to August, you mean prior to my getting involved in establishing the second channel?
No, I don't mean prior to your getting involved in it. I mean prior to the meeting in August.
There was no discussion on that subject.
Up until that time?
That is correct.
Did you have any discussions shortly thereafter?
Yes, we did.
With whom?
Well, originally with General Secord, and there came a time that Colonel North and the CIA officials as well as Iranians were also informed.
Approximately how long after the meeting in Brussels did these conversations occur?
No longer than a month.
And would you describe them?
Well, the detailed discussion, when I say detailed, I do not mean to the extent that we talked about the sums or methods of payment and how. It was very specific in the meetings that we had on a Saturday, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in the offices of STTGI, where we held an all-day meeting with the presence of the Iranians as well as CIA official, Lieutenant Colonel North, General Secord, and myself, this issue was very clearly discussed in presence of all the parties that I mentioned.
Before we get to that discussion, perhaps we should set the scene a little bit further. I take it after the meeting in Brussels, you reported back to Colonel North.
General Secord did.
But you learned about that?
Yes, I knew that was going to happen.
And was it agreed with Colonel North, and General Secord, and you that a meeting should be arranged with this Iranian official in the U.S.?
Yes, it had two purposes. First, for Colonel North to get involved, and secondly, to test to see how sincere the second channel was and if they were prepared to take the risk of coming to the United States. And that was a very brave step on the part of the Iranians, because at that time there were also factions operating within the structure of the Iranian government that did not support this method of approach towards the United States. And to this date, I admire the group that decided to stick their neck out and approach us, brave people.
But they did eventually come?
Yes, sir.
And that was in September of 1986?
That's correct.
And that was when this all-day meeting occurred at STTGI?
No, sir. We had a prior meeting at the offices of Colonel North, and there was also a break for lunch, and we continued with the discussions. And I might add that there were times that I did not participate in the meetings. Mr. George Cave at that time was aboard, and it was my desire, as well as the desire of the other parties, for me to maintain my commercial role. So there were areas that I stepped out of the room. And the meeting lasted until late in the afternoon that day. And
are you describing the meeting now at Colonel North's office or the meeting at STTGI?
No, the meeting at the old executive office in Colonel North's office. Towards the end of the day, after we broke off and arranged to have the meeting next day at our offices, Colonel North and I took our guest for a tour of the White House, and we took him to every corner in the White House, and by then Colonel North...
Did that include the Oval Office?
Yes, we went also. We did not actually walk into the Oval Office. The doors were open. There was a little rope barrier in front there, but we showed him the rooms, and Colonel North by this time was also impressed by this gentleman, and he was feeling, after many months of frustration, he was feeling upbeat. And it's interesting to know that while we were passing by one of the corridors, stepping down the stairs, we came across a picture was hanging on the wall. It portrayed a table, and like a conference table, and there were dogs sitting around the table, and I remember there was one of the dogs that was taking a little nap, and Ali was feeling very upbeat, and he asked me to translate for our guest that this represented our cabinet, and that was Mr. Casey, who was taking a nap. That broke the ice.
I take it during the meeting that preceded the tour of the White House, you had talked about normalizing relations between the two countries?
Yes, we did.
And you talked about the U.S. providing military equipment to Iran?
That's correct.
And you talked about the possibility of the Iranians obtaining the release of the hostages in Lebanon.
Yes, sir.
Now, I think you said then there was a meeting at STTGI the next day at which the subject of money for you came up.
Myself and the group who assisted me to open the second channel.
This is a group of Iranians, I take it.
That is correct.
And that included government officials and also private?
Well, I was led to believe that there was at least one person in that group that was government official.
Would you describe...
This does not refer to the gentleman that headed the delegation and the gentleman that we took for the tour of the White House. There was a second gentleman that we all believed to be directly connected to the Iranian government.
Would you describe the discussion then that took place the next day at STTGI on the subject of financial remuneration for you and these Iranians?
Well, I had, it was not really a new item for discussion. I had, at the time of starting the efforts to open the second channel, I mentioned to General Secord that the only way we can achieve this is through commercial contacts, and we have to be prepared to treat it as such. During the, I believe, the Saturday meeting at STTGI, the other gentlemen who were accompanying our guest took me aside, and they wanted to know if I had indeed clarified their status, and I came back into the room.
These were the Iranians?
That is correct, sir. Came back to the room and in a very open, clear manner brought the subject up. Our guest was also present, and I was told we are at the early stages of this channel. We don't know how this thing is going to shape up. We recognize what you are telling us. We agree, and we will deal with it at the appropriate time.
When you say we recognize what you're telling us, what were you referring to?
In other words, they were accepting my position that there should be a financial benefit for myself and my group.
So and when you say you went back into the room, I take it you mean you went back into the room where Colonel North and CIA people were present?
And General Secord, yes.
And you told them that you had just had a discussion with the Iranians outside the room?
The two other Iranians, the Iranian official that I referred to him as our guest was inside with the rest of the American delegation, and I had a little discussion with the other two outside of the conference room, and I came back and made sure that this issue would not be forgotten. They were all intensely involved in discussing politics, hostages, and so on. So I made sure that that was also part of their discussion.
And you keep saying that and this. I take it what you're referring to is the requirement...
The financial remuneration.
For?
Opening the second channel.
And remuneration for the Iranians and for you?
That is correct.
And you made both parts clear, I take it?
Yes, sir.
And that was agreed to by the people in the room?
In principle.
Was any particular amount or method of remunerating you and the Iranian officials agreed on at the time?
It was left to the future, and after they had a better understanding of how the relationship would develop. It was too early to be specific.
I take it you regarded this trip by the Iranians to this country and the meetings at the old Executive Office building and at STTGI to have been basically successful.
Very much so.
But I take it there was no final agreement reached.
Well, the agreement, are you referring to the financial end of it or the political?
No, I'm asking, I take it that there was no particular agreement reached during this September trip to the United States with respect to arms and hostages.
No, we were evaluating each other, each sort of testing the intents of each other. For the first time, we saw that we were not going past each other. We were focusing, we were on the same frequency for the first time.
And was it agreed to have another meeting?
Definitely. That was the conclusion of the meeting, that both parties would report back to their governments, evaluate the situation, and arrange for a meeting where more detailed discussions would be held.
And was there, in fact, a meeting in Frankfurt in October?
Yes, sir.
And I take it you and General Secord were both present?
That is correct.
And Colonel North?
As well as Mr. George Cave.
CIA official?
That's correct.
And I take it the Iranians, the Second Channel, and these other Iranians were also present?
Well, this time there were additional people who joined the group.
From the Iranian side?
From the Iranian government, yes.
And did you have a discussion during the meeting in Frankfurt also about normalizing relations between the countries?
Definitely.
And did you have a discussion about the provision of U.S. military equipment to Iran?
Very much so.
And the hostage issue also came up?
Definitely.
Was there some kind of a written proposal made at that meeting?
I can't recall if it was during that meeting or a different meeting that that written proposal came about. To the best of my recollection, there were 2 or 3 meetings that both delegations came to Germany, and I also recall a separate meeting that I participated alone, or it could have been part of the 3 meetings that I came earlier to talk to one of the very important members of the Iranian delegations. There were a number of meetings. There was a time that the agreement that you're referring to was discussed.
And this was still in October of 1986?
That is correct.
And this proposal was made by Colonel North?
Well, it was discussed by Colonel North. I don't know how it came to be prepared. He had prepared a 7-point document that was the subject of our intense discussions with the Iranians.
Would you turn to Exhibit 22?
I have that.
Is that the 7-point plan to which you referred?
Yes, sir.
And is that in Mr. North's handwriting?
Yes, sir.
And I take it, I won't have you read the entire thing, the document speaks for itself, but was that the proposal that was being discussed with the Iranians?
That's correct.
And it provides for the provision of 500 tows and Hawk spare parts, and it provides for the release of hostages, among other things.
That's correct.
Did the Iranians agree to this 7-point plan?
The bottom line was that they did not, and the meeting was not successful. It broke off with disappointment on the part of both parties. Colin North got ready to leave for the United States. To report back that there would not be any success dealing with the second channel. I urged him to be more patient. He was very specific. He told me, Albert, it will take me 6 hours, take Colin North 6 hours to get to Washington, and he was going to have a meeting at about 6 o'clock that day with the president. That's what he told me. And unless I come up with something prior to him going to the president, he has to report to the president that the meeting was not successful. So I was left behind to see what I can do to turn this thing around.
So North left, and you proceeded to try to reach an agreement with the Iranians in the 6 hours.
That's correct.
Can you describe what the major objections or problems were with the 7-point plan?
I believe the basic problem, there were basically two problems. One, I would say, cultural and lack of basic communication. I'm not saying the same type of communication that did not exist during the first channel, and lack of patience on the part of our delegation. We were very impatient. We were expecting to, I told our group that we want to establish a relationship as if we are preparing stew in a pressure cooker. That is not possible. You have to be patient, spend a lot of time, try to understand each other. And so because of those two reasons, they could not allocate enough time to understand each other, which I succeeded to do after they left.
So you did continue the negotiations?
Yes, sir.
And did you and the second channel then reach an agreement?
Well, we agreed on what I refer to a 9-point proposal, which later on was communicated to Colin North as well as General Secord, and then it was agreed upon. And later that became a 9-point agreement.
Now this 9-point agreement, I take it you had a copy of that written in Farsi, which you provided to the committees.
I had an original copy which I provided you with.
And have you also done an English translation of that Farsi document, leaving out certain names?
I did that, I believe, yesterday, yes. I translated that yesterday.
And is that document...
I might add, Mr. Niels, that the original Farsi version of the 9-point agreement that I provided you with is written in the handwriting of the Iranian official, who was different than the gentleman who came to Washington, and this is the gentleman that I referred to very quickly yesterday, that I became very, very fond of this person, and I hope that there would be questions asked about this second channel. I won't take your time about that, but I was very impressed with this person.
This was written by...
This man's handwriting. what you have.
And this man that you're describing who actually wrote the 9-point plan in Farsi was one of the officials that you had an obligation to remunerate in some way at some future time, I take it?
Absolutely not. To the contrary.
Oh, this was actually the second channel that you're talking about.
This gentleman, to the contrary, I became very fond of this man. I got to learn about him and his family. And during one of the trips that he took to Germany, met with me, I wanted to act like a host. We were in Germany. I bought some shirts and jeans for his kids. He refused to accept them. I insisted, and actually I put it in his suitcase, and he did something very remarkable. He stopped fighting me, but when we were in the taxi and I was getting ready to leave, I said goodbye to him, and before the taxi drove away, he pushed a $100 bill into my coat pocket. Effectively, I still owe him $50. A remarkable man, very brave man.
In any event, your translation of his 9-point plan in Farsi is pages 3 and 4 of Exhibit 22. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, at the top of that page, you have a note. I take it that's a summary of what occurs at the top of the document in Farsi rather than a translation.
You are correct, sir.
But what follows is your attempt to do a translation. Is that correct?
In a very short time that I had available to me.
Now, in the very first paragraph, it says, Iran provides funds to Mr. Hakim for 500 tows, and if willing, Iranians will provide for the Hawk spare parts which remain from the previous agreement. Should that read, will provide funds for the Hawk spare parts?
Yeah, that was left out. You're correct, yes.
Now, there is a reference in the 9-point plan, which appears to be absent from the 7-point plan, to the release of certain Kuwaitis, 17 persons. That's item number 3.
Yes, yes, sir.
Was that one of the subjects of contention that the Iranians raised with respect to the 7-point plan?
That was one of the issues that caused the meeting to end without success while Colonel North was negotiating it.
And you proposed that the problem be solved by having you providing a plan or promising to provide a plan for the release of these Kuwaitis.
That's correct.
And then item number 4 says 1.5 American hostages in Lebanon will be released. What did that mean, 1.5?
This is very interesting. This is the question that eventually Colonel North asked me. General Secord had a commitment, so while I was doing this patching up work, General Secord was absent, and he had the KL-43 machine with him, and right about the same time that Colonel North was getting ready to go and report to the President, I managed to get him on the phone, and in riddles I went over the 9 points, and when I got to 1.5 hostages, he asked me if I was drunk. He thought that we were going to cut one of the hostages in half. I explained to him that really the half indicates that's provided in the text. The seriousness of the Iranians to make a very sincere effort with the Lebanese for the release of the second hostage. This second channel was very candid with us. This gentleman who prepared this document, very honest, very open. He was a tough negotiator, but he never misled me. He was referred to as a monster because he kept his ground. But when he promised me to put in there 1.5, he understood, and I understood what it means. It meant that he actually will take a trip, personally take a trip to, after clearing it with his superiors, to Lebanon and try to see what he can do for the release of the second hostage. This man showed repeatedly signs of bravery in various forms. So 1.5 indicates definitely 1, and that obligation was met by the Iranians. The half meant that it is not just empty words. He would actually take steps, and it was understood that he would personally take a trip to Lebanon.
And then I take it, as you've already testified, you communicated this 9-point plan to Colonel North.
I asked him, since we could not discuss this without compromising it over the phone, I urged Colonel North to delay reporting that the second channel was a failure until General Secord and I had the opportunity to send him a KL-43 message, and he accepted.
And the KL-43 message summarized the 9-point plan in English?
It did, and then the follow-up to that was General Secord's personal comment that he said the more he reads the 9 points, the more he likes it, even better than the 7 points.
And did you eventually learn that the 9-point plan was accepted by the U.S. government side?
Yes, sir.
And was it also accepted by the Iranian government side?
Yes, it was, since I had made it clear to the Iranians that I am not negotiating this thing on the behest of the United States government. I'm just trying to make sure that continuity would be maintained. I agreed on a code to be passed on directly by Mr. Cave to the Iranians, indicating that code would be the sign that they have accepted the 9-point agreement, and that indeed took place, and Mr. Cave did call and gave him the coded message.
And I take it eventually 500 tow missiles were shipped?
That's correct, sir.
And 1 hostage was released?
That's correct.
And that was in late October, early November 1986?
You're correct, sir.
Now, did the subject of money for you come up again during this period of time?
By this time, since we had gotten closer to the nucleus of the Iranian government, we became more professional, if you will, and tried to have the financial end of the discussion in separate meetings without the presence of this gentleman that I refer to as the monster. He turned out to be a good friend. So there were meetings and discussions on that issue, but not mixed with the official discussions.
You say they were mixed or not mixed?
Not mixed.
Was an agreement ever reached as to precisely how much or how you were going to be remunerated and how much or how the Iranians would be remunerated?
No, sir, we still had not gotten into this far enough to evaluate our situation.
Did you continue meeting with the Iranians following the shipment of tows in late October and the release of a hostage?
Very much so, and when we were not meeting, we were in constant telephone contact.
And did you indeed continue to meet even after there had been some disclosures about the fact that the U.S. was shipping arms to Iran?
Yes, sir.
But I take it there came a time in late November of 1986 when the meetings essentially ceased.
That was the time that I was asked. I don't know if the meetings stopped or not. I was asked by Mr. Cave on behalf of the U.S. government to arrange for one final meeting between the Iranians and the Americans, and this time with the presence of the State Department representative and a gentleman by the name of Charles Dunbar accompanied Mr. Cave. I arranged with the Iranians to come to Frankfurt. I briefed them when they arrived as to what was happening, and I told them that after this introduction I will not be able to be in contact with them as the representative of the delegation. They accepted to meet with Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Cave. They asked me if I were prepared to also participate in the meeting. I checked with Mr. Cave. I said, I am prepared to attend the meeting. Iranians are showing a sign of anxiousness, and they will feel more comfortable if I participated. I believe he went back and checked with Mr. Dunbar, came back to me, said that there's no problem in my participating. At that time I had my attorney with me in Europe, Mr. Janis. He actually had come with me to Frankfurt. Then I told Mr. Cave to inform Mr. Dunbar that I would be prepared to participate in the meeting if he would accept for my attorney to be also present. He refused, therefore I did not participate in the meeting, and I really don't know what continued or discontinued after that introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Hakim. I'd now like to turn back again briefly to the subject of these money and the Swiss records.
Yes, sir.
I'd like you to turn to exhibit number 23. It is an investment management agreement between Albert Hakim and CSF Investments Limited. You have that in front of you.
Yes, sir.
And is that a document that you recently provided to the committees?
Yes, that's correct.
And what does this document represent?
This, after having had the opportunity of reviewing all the records with you during the deposition, effectively not only it represents the portion of the capital account related to me, but it also represents any other monies that CSF could not find a name for or categorize it or allocate it, so that effectively was to them known as Albert Hakim's account.
And So this is, you've already testified about some investment management agreements relating to Albert Hakim's sub-accounts. I take it this is the general Albert Hakim account. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it covers money which CSF was investing on your behalf.
That was the intention, yes.
And when was this document executed?
It appears that there is no date on this. This is very possible to have been signed sometimes much later after the revelation, because I did sign a number of documents for CSF that were not completed and executed. Therefore, their status as far as the Swiss government was concerned was incomplete, and with the revelation, they had to have someone owning those accounts. So a number of documents were signed in my hotel room at a later date. I suppose, I cannot be certain, but I suppose this is one of those documents, so it's not dated.
And this would be in the period approximately November, December 1986?
If it's among those documents, yes.
And I take it if that's the case, there was always an account in your name at CSF, but you're saying this document was signed to make a record of that account perhaps in November of 1986?
That's correct.
I'd like you to take a look at exhibit number 24.
I have that in front of me.
Is that another document you recently provided to the committees?
That's also correct.
And is this the investment management agreement relating to the Coral Assets account?
Yes, sir.
And this would cover monies managed by CSF for Coral Assets, I take it?
You're correct, sir.
This document bears the date September 17, 1985. Do you have any reason to believe that document was signed on any different date than that?
I cannot be precise about this because on page 5, as you notice, it does not bear my signature or Genesee Court's signature. It has the signature of the lady responsible for CSF investment, and where it says signature of the client, it appears to be in front of that phrase, it appears to be the signature of Mr. Farina. I cannot be certain, but this is what I can make out of it. Therefore, I cannot be sure about the date, if it was executed exactly then or later.
The question is whether you have any reason to believe that it's the wrong date.
I believe if we refer to the records, that should fall within the time that we started to put money in this account. Therefore, if that should coincide with those commission distribution, then I have no reason to believe that this is incorrect.
I'd like you to turn to exhibit number 25.
I have that in front of me.
Is that also a document that you recently provided to the committees?
That's correct.
And is that an investment management agreement between SciTech Trading Group and CSF dated November 12th, 1985?
That's correct.
And I'll ask you to turn to exhibit number 26. Is that another document that you recently provided to the committees?
That's correct, sir.
And is this an investment management agreement between bellybutton and CSF Investments?
That's correct, and we referred to this yesterday, and I brought to the attention of the committees that this signature is not signed. Sorry, this document has no signature, it's not signed, it's incomplete.
I take it B button stands for belly button,
That's correct.
and it bears a printed date of the 22nd of May, 1986.
That's also correct.
And what, if you know, is the reason why this investment and I take it this covers the $200,000 that was placed into the button account on the 20th of May, 1986.
It should have, but this also doesn't have the Appendix A that we have seen with the other similar fiduciary agreements. That part is also missing, but the answer to your question is yes.
And if you know, why was this document not signed?
Because it never got off the ground, as I testified yesterday. We never managed to make use of this account, and therefore it was remained incomplete.
Now, Mr. Hakim, you testified yesterday about an investment management agreement for Albert Hakim subaccount number 1. That's Exhibit 17, and it bears the date of May 15th, 1986. My only question at this point in time is, was that, to your knowledge, was that investment management agreement signed on or about May 15, 1986, as it indicates?
You are right, sir.
And then you testified about another investment management agreement, which is Exhibit 19, which is Albert Hakim subaccount number 2, and that bears a date of the 16th of June, 1986, and my only question to you at this time is, was that the date on or about the date on which this was executed?
To the best of my recollection, that's correct, sir.
Now, there's one final investment management agreement which you have not yet testified about. That's Exhibit number 21. It is denoted Albert Hakim subaccount number 3. It has an Appendix A, which indicates that the account covers an amount of $200,000. It also bears the date of the 16th of June, 1986. My first question is whether that's the date on or about the time when it was signed.
I am reasonably sure that that date is correct.
And what, if you recall, was the purpose of Albert Hakim subaccount number 3?
If you recall, we searched to see if we could come up with the correct explanation for this subaccount. I cannot be certain, Mr. Niels, as to what this is. The restructure of the dates and the reasoning that we followed during my deposition, I believe also that did not help us to identify exactly what this $200,000 was.
The answer is you're uncertain.
I'm uncertain, that's correct.
Now, you've just identified 7 different investment management agreements with CSF, covering different entities and different amounts of money. I take it the monies put into these, into the custody of CSF to be invested pursuant to these investment management agreements were monies that came out of the corporate bank accounts that you set up for the Iran and Nicaragua initiatives that you've been testifying about for the last 2 days.
You're correct, sir.
And these monies were then put into the custody of CSF, and CSF invested them for the benefit of the various entities that are covered by these agreements.
Yes, which effectively is this pigeonholed enterprise, yes.
And I should state that you have also supplied for the committee's documents from CSF reflecting the current amounts of money which are being invested by CSF pursuant to each of these 7 investment management agreements.
That's correct, sir.
And those are Exhibits 11 through 15. You don't need to turn to them. I'll simply state that for the record. And there are 7 of them. They're numbered Exhibits 11, 12A, 12B, 12C, 13, 14, and 15. And I'd like you to turn to Exhibit 16, which contains lists the amounts reflected by Exhibits 11 through 15, the amounts of money which are currently being managed by CSF pursuant to these various investment management agreements. And it shows that the Albert Hakim general account, denominated here regular, currently has $254,000 in it, approximately. The sub-account 1 currently has $2,170,000 in it, approximately. Sub-account number 2 has $2,093,000 in it, approximately. Sub-account number 3 has $160,000 in it, approximately. The Coral Assets account has $1,578,000, approximately. The SciTech account has $193,000, approximately. And the Button account has $216,000, approximately, for a total of $6,667,000. And I take it that is the $6.67 million currently held by CSF that you testified about yesterday.
That's correct, sir.
Then if you would turn to Exhibit number 41. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
I will state that the left-hand column, headed Capital Distributions to 12,486, shows the money coming out of the various corporate bank accounts that you testified about yesterday, such as Lake Resources, which your accountants classified as distributions for the benefit of the partners. I think you testified about that.
Yes, sir.
And that adds up to a total of $9.6 million. And that's also the figure that appears on the chart behind us as having been allocated by your accountants to the capital accounts.
Yes, sir.
Again, indicating money coming out of the corporate bank accounts, which the accountants recorded as being distributions for the benefit of the partners.
Yes, sir.
Then the middle column shows the current amount of these funds which remain with CSF and are being invested for the benefit of the partners. Do you see that?
That's correct.
And the amount opposite your name constitutes all of the money from your accounts plus the various sub-accounts.
Yes, sir.
And then there's, underneath that is the amount for General Secord's Coral Assets account and the SciTech account and the Button account for a total of 6.667.
Yes, sir.
You see that?
Yes,
and
sir.
that's the amount that you just testified about.
That's correct.
Now, that leaves a difference, and the difference is in the right-hand column, and those are funds which were disposed of in some way other than being put in and kept in the custody of CSF for investment purposes?
Yes, sir.
And I take it, as you testified yesterday, some of that difference was distributed directly to the partners such as yourself and put in your own personal bank account.
Yes, sir.
And some of it was distributed to third parties for operational expenses or other purposes.
That's also correct.
Now, there is no amount indicated here for the CT account. What is the reason for that?
Mr. Klein's always withdrew his commissions as soon as he had a chance, so it means there is no balance due to him. I think that's the best answer I can give you. I am not aware of any other way.
Well, I want to sharpen the question just to be certain, Mr. Hakim. Are you saying that none of Mr. Klein's money ever went to CSF to be invested on his behalf, or are you saying that you simply don't know and they wouldn't tell you?
I would say both answers would be relevant. I don't know, and if CSF did invest it for Mr. Klein's, they will never tell me. They are very discreet.
But the best of your knowledge is that Mr. Klein's money was not given to CSF, he just took it himself.
That's my best guess.
Now, this document of this chart, Exhibit 41, also reflects that the amount in the Coral Assets account, which is being invested and managed by CSF, is substantially larger than the amount that the accountants attributed to his account coming out of the various corporate bank accounts. Do you see that?
That's correct, yes.
Do you know where this extra $500,000 came from?
Partially could be gain in the investment, such as interest, but that would not total up to $500,000.
So assuming that part of the difference is made up by profitable investments, do you know where the rest of it came from?
The answer is no, probably misallocation. I don't know.
Now, I should state that after the proceeding yesterday, our accountants, Mr. Haller and Mr. Zanardi, brought to my attention that the documents that you provided last Sunday relating to the CSF investment management account for Coral Assets reflect that in addition to money going into that account, there was in fact some money which came out of that account, which appears to have been for Mr. Secord's personal benefit, and Mr. Lyman will be asking you some further questions about that, I believe, later on. You testified yesterday, Mr. Hakim, that your most recent information was that the $6.67 million was currently in Toronto Dominion Securities account in London, but that the records that you had given us might provide a more current answer. We have reviewed those records. There is an indication that the monies are in the custody of Merrill Lynch in London. Have you had a chance yourself to check and get even more recent information?
I personally didn't have a chance by it, but my attorneys had the opportunity this morning to check up on that, and it appears that information that you just gave is correct.
That the money has recently been moved and is in the custody of Merrill Lynch in London?
I don't know when it was moved, but At this time, it is with Merrill Lynch in London, yes.
And this is money, I take it, which is still being managed by CSF Investments?
Yes, and if it has been moved recently, probably CSF is doing their job. They could get a better return on it, and that's why they moved it.
Mr. Hakim, I'd like you to turn to exhibit number 27. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, sir.
I'll ask you to turn to the second page of the exhibit. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
And is that one of the documents that you provided to the committees some time ago?
That's correct.
And is this, do you recognize the handwriting on this document?
It appears to be Mr. Zucker's handwriting.
And you see there's the initials WZ at the bottom of the page. Is that, to the best of your knowledge, the initials of Willard Zucker?
Yes, sir.
Now, you'll see on this document there's a reference to Mrs. Bellybutton.
Yes, I do.
And I take it that that would be, who would that be a reference to?
I would refer that to Mrs. North.
There's also a reference to an amount of $15,000.
At the bottom of that structure, yes.
And do you know what that's a reference to?
I don't know. I can only speculate.
You have no recollection of what this document relates to?
No, sir. I don't have.
Now, I note that it says RV Secord in a box towards the upper left-hand corner, and the words small fee after it. What do those refer to?
I do not know that either, sir.
Then there is the name STTGI Wire at the top of the page, again with $15,000 and an arrow next to it.
I don't have any knowledge of that either.
Then there is a bank account at First American Bank of Virginia in McLean with the letters STTGI right above it. What does that refer to?
I believe during the deposition we identified that to be the STTGI bank account.
Now, the question that I must ask you, Mr. Hakim, is whether I should say that this appears to relate to other documents that are attached, dated in early May 1986, showing transfers of approximately $15,000 to the First American Bank of Virginia from CSF. And my question to you is whether, to your recollection, there was ever a time when $15,000 was transferred from Switzerland eventually into the STTGI bank account in Virginia for the benefit of Mrs. North?
I do not have such information, and I find that very irregular if such thing would happen.
So you're saying you believe it did not happen?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Mr. Van Cleve? Mr. Van Cleve?
Mr. Hakim, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, sir.
I'd like to start this afternoon by establishing a few additional facts about your background for the benefit of the committee, if I might.
Please.
You testified yesterday that you attended your senior year of high school in San Luis Obispo, California. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you then went on to California State Polytechnic College, correct?
That's correct.
And your training there was in electronics, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
You are correct.
You testified at your deposition that the business that you established in Iran, which you called Multicorp, included an electronics equipment calibration center. Is that correct?
Also, yes,
Right, and that the general nature of that business was highly technical.
very much so.
Okay. You also testified, and I'm quoting here, "I have for all my professional life been working in the area of high technology." Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Sometime after 1973, you formed Stanford Technology Corporation United States as a wholly owned subsidiary of Stanford Technology SA. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And the principal business of Stanford Technology US was systems, specifically communications and intelligence collection systems. Is that correct?
At that time, yes.
And is it correct to describe those intelligence collection systems as including receiving stations, receivers covering a wide spectrum of frequencies, which use computers and tape recorders to capture transmissions and record them, and then give that capability to the client or the customer? Would that be a fair general description?
For interpretation of the information received, yes.
Right. Am I correct that you also purchased, through Stanford Technology US, the facilities of a company referred to as International Imaging Systems?
That's correct.
And that company had been engaged in image processing, correct?
That's correct.
And is it correct that image processing, as it's used in this context, employs a computerized electronic facility that interprets aerial photography?
That's correct.
And is it also correct that these aerial photos are fed into this image processing system and through coloring and enhancement give you an interpretation of the photos?
That's the area of the image processing that we discussed during the deposition, but it's not limited to that.
I understand that, but, and you indicated that there were a range of clients that could be used, that could use image processing. I think you mentioned agriculture and various forms of science. Is that correct?
Medicine and so on, yes.
Would it be fair to describe image processing also as a form of intelligence collection system? Would it have that application?
Yes, you could reach to that conclusion.
I believe you testified that you sold International Imaging Systems for $3 million in the early 1980s. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now I'm going to change subjects slightly and ask you about your knowledge of certain individuals.
Please.
Again, by way of establishing additional background information. When did you first meet Yaakov Nimrodi?
It was in Iran, I believe during the time that I was with Telecom Limited. My best guess would be sometimes about mid-65.
Okay, and in what connection did you say?
At the time, Telecom Limited represented Motorola, and about the same time, Motorola established a joint venture and manufacturing capability in Israel. Iran was then assigned to Israel for their needs. Mr. Nimrodi was with the Israeli embassy at that time, and one of the functions that he performed was to promote Israeli products, and it was in connection with Motorola that I came to meet Mr. Nimrodi.
So would it be fair to say then that you've known Mr. Nimrodi for many years and that you're familiar with his method of business operation?
That is correct.
When did you first meet Manikir Banafar?
Mr. Van Cleve, before you proceed, I'd like to announce that the House is now conducting a vote. This accounts for the absence of the House panel members. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When did you first meet Manikir Banafar?
I believe the first time I met him was right after or about the same time that a new company that he had formed, or it was caused to be formed for him to operate from. And to the best of my recollection, the name of that company, which had to do with shipping and forwarding, was Starline. And
about when would this have been?
Oh, I would say sometimes between early 1970.
Okay. And again,
72,
then it
74.
would be fair to say that you've known Mr. Ghorbanifar for many years and you're familiar with his method of business operation. Is that correct?
Well, not in the same manner that I came to learn about Mr. Nimrodi. I met Mr. Ghorbanifar, but my knowledge about the method of him running his business was through other sources.
Fair enough. You testified that your first involvement with the Iranian initiative came when General Secord asked you to locate a man named Ghorbanifar in Paris. Is that correct? I'm changing subjects now a little bit. I'm going to move into the Iranian initiative.
I understand. Yes, that was prior to my participation in early '86, yes.
Right. But he asked you to locate a certain man named Ghorbanifar, correct?
Well, he apparently had a bunch of telephone numbers for Mr. Ghorbanifar, and as he came to lose him and didn't have a possibility of locating him, he asked me to search for him using the numbers he gave me.
And you then asked him if he was referring to Manicur Ghorbanifar, is that correct?
Yes, by then, earlier we had discussed about Mr. Ghorbanifar. He told me that he could not be the same person, but by then...
Well, that's the point I want to get to. Did you tell Mr. Secord at that time in substance that if he was talking about Manicur Ghorbanifar, you did know him?
Yes.
And did you tell him also that he was a former Savak agent who had been recruited by the Israelis?
I believe by then they had established that fact themselves.
And what was General Secord's response when you told him that, if you recall? Did he tell you, no, it could not be the same person that he was interested in?
There was a time, I think it was a much earlier time, when he mentioned Mr. Ghorbanifar name to me, and I told him that I knew a Manucher Ghorbanifar with a description that I gave him. At that time he told me, no, it cannot be the same person.
No, it cannot be the same person.
It could very well, the motivation, knowing General Secord, probably at that time he didn't have authorization to cut me in that affair.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about your participation in the February 1986 meeting where you served as translator. I believe you testified that you eventually translated at the meeting because Mr. Ghorbanifar was not providing accurate translation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you also testified that the two sides at the meeting were not communicating. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the reason for that was that the United States representative was discussing the long-range strategic issues in the relationship, correct?
And also removal the so-called obstacles referring to the hostages.
Right,
Yes.
but at the same time, the Iranian representative appeared to be principally interested in what he referred to as Volkswagens. Is that correct?
Yes, referring to weapons.
Okay. And you then told us, the committee yesterday, about a conversation that you had in the hallway afterwards with the Iranian representative. And what I wanted to ask you is, what conclusion did you draw from that conversation and from the fact that Ghorbanifar was the middleman? What conclusion did you draw about the value of this channel to the United States?
It confirmed my earlier assessment. I had, even prior to the start of the meetings, after they briefed me during the time that General Secord, Colonel North, and the CIA official and another gentleman, they were present. I indicated to them that I'm very pessimistic that this thing would be positive.
And if I might interrupt just briefly, that was because you already knew some of the people who were involved, didn't you?
I knew all of them.
You knew all of them, and you knew what their past history was, and you knew their method of operation.
Very much so.
And you didn't think this was going to be a successful way of establishing a strategic relationship with Iran, did you?
That was my definite conclusion. I was very sure that it was the wrong way to go.
Right. Now, after the meeting, which you say confirmed that opinion of yours, did you tell the American representatives of your conclusion?
I believe there was an evolution. I believe Colonel North started to slowly but surely focus on my opinion on Iran. At the beginning, they simply looked upon me as a businessman, but when I started to make various predictions and assessments and judgments, and they turned out to be correct, they started to pay a little bit more attention to it.
You testified at your deposition that there was a sharp difference between the participants in the first channel and the participants in the second channel. Please tell the committee, in your view, what the difference between those two channels was.
The second channel was more sincere. They were more devoted. They knew what they wanted. They understood that the relationship should not be limited to the United States supplying only arms. They were interested in a long-term relationship. They did not turn the discussions to go in the manner that there would be any indication that there is personal financial interest for the officials. It was just the difference between day and night.
The difference between day and night. I have a couple of questions about your participation in the planning for the Tehran trip. You participated in the negotiations between February and May, which led up to that trip, correct?
Well, I did not have any say-so about the trip. As a matter of fact, I was against it, but that's besides the point. I did not have, I understand your question to mean that I participated in a substantive, I had an effectiveness in making that decision. I did not participate in such.
I did not intend to apply that. I think perhaps it would be better to say that you assisted the participants in the negotiation. You spoke,
Yes,
for example.
yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
Did the United States ever agree, to your knowledge, to bring a specific percentage, such as 50%, of the Hawk spare parts to Tehran when Mr. McFarland went to Tehran?
I don't believe it was agreed as to the percentage. To the best of my recollection, it was a function of how much they could load the plane, taking everything else into consideration. How much it was meant to take as much as they could, but not giving them everything that they wanted, to show a token of seriousness.
Did the Iranian side ever agree, to your knowledge, to release all the remaining hostages, either prior to or at the beginning of the McFarland trip to Tehran?
To the best of my recollection, there was never any discussion, especially during the time that I spoke with the first channel, that there was an understanding that all the hostages would be released. I really, from the part of the information that I had any contact with, I cannot recall any time that was spoken that all hostages would be released. That must have been misconception by someone at some time, somewhere.
I have just a couple of additional questions, Mr. Hakim, and they relate to Exhibit 22. Would you please turn to that?
Yes, sir.
You testified in response to questions by Mr. Nields that this proposal, the 7-point proposal, was prepared during a meeting that was held between the Second Channel representatives and Colonel North, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
I don't believe I said during the meeting. I said it was made available for discussion at that meeting. I don't know when it was prepared.
Okay, and this meeting would have been in late September or early October of 1986, if I've got the dates correct?
I really cannot, definitely not in September. It was one of the October meetings.
One of the October meetings. The first point says, U.S. proposal, Iran provides funds for 500 tows and remainder of Hawk parts. Now, did that mean that Iran was supposed to provide additional money for Hawk parts?
That was my understanding.
And do you know how much money?
I can't recall, no.
Looking at point 6, and this is a sequence of events, obviously, it begins, Iran will then, and it says release, and I think that word is PATTIS, P-A-T-T-I-S.
Yes.
The second point is return body of Buckley.
Yes.
And the third point is provide copy of Buckley debrief.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell me what the discussion at the meeting was concerning those last 2 points?
Colonel North was very much interested to achieve these objectives. And again, this was another issue that led to the failure of our meeting.
Why was that? Was there resistance on this issue from the Iranian side?
No, that was not the conclusion that I came to. It was the position that this gentleman took, that I testified earlier. He was very honest. He didn't try to mislead us. He did not want to promise more than what he could deliver. And he said that the way things stand, he is not going to be able to do this for the United States unless the United States could do something for the Lebanese. The heart of failure of the meeting was that the Iranians were taking the position that they had drawn from their resources as much as they could. The attitude of the the Lebanese was that they were giving assistance to Iran, and Iran was benefiting, but the Lebanese did not gain anything out of this, and it was about time for the United States to do something for the Lebanese, and that's why the question of the 17 prisoners and so on. So the reason was not the resistance, the reason was that this man did not want to promise something that he could not deliver.
Tell the committee, if you will, what the Buckley debrief refers to.
It refers to what was understood to be several hundred pages of debriefing that was obtained by the captors of the CIA chief station in Lebanon, Mr. Buckley, refers to that, and this was a very touchy issue. I'm sure that once we start talk more about the second channel, we will see why this was very touchy about that.
Do you know the circumstances under which those debriefing notes were obtained?
No, these, it was a known secret that the debriefings were obtained under torturing Mr. Buckley, but it was not a subject that we discussed during the meeting.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hakim.
Thank you.
Chairman Hamilton?
Mr. Chairman, I understand that you're going to call a recess now, and the House Select Committee will have an important meeting in room SR 301 immediately.
The hearing will stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.